The years 1300 to 1600 saw a revival of interest in the values and achievements of the classical past. Called the Renaissance, a term that literally means rebirth, it began in Italy and later spread north to the rest of Europe. The Renaissance started in Italy for several reasons. First, Italy was divided into many separate cities, while most of northern Europe was still agricultural and ruled by monarchs. These cities were centers of trade, which produced wealth that could support learning and the arts. Wealth from trade led to the rise of a class of merchants and bankers who succeeded and became wealthy through their individual skill and ability. They used their wealth to promote the arts and learning. Third, Italian artists and scholars were surrounded and inspired by the remains of ancient Rome, which sparked an interest in studying history and newly discovered ancient Greek and Roman texts. Many of these texts had been acquired during the Crusades or from Byzantine scholars who came to Italy in the 1300s and 1400s. For most people in Italy, life did not change much in the Renaissance. The wealthy elite, however, embraced new values. Upper-class Italians became more secular, which means they were less focused on religion and the afterlife and took more time to enjoy the pleasures of life in this world, including food, artwork, and literature. Many became patrons, or people who used their wealth to support cultural activities such as art, theater, science, and literature. Many wealthy Italians achieved success through their own skill and ability, and this led to a new emphasis on individualism. By having their portraits painted or donating art to the city to place in public squares, the wealthy people demonstrated the importance of themselves and their families. The Renaissance supported a spirit of adventure and a wide-ranging curiosity that led people to explore new worlds or re-examine old ones. Navigators who sailed across the oceans, scientists who looked at the universe in new ways, and writers and artists who experimented with new forms and techniques all shared that spirit. In part, this spirit of adventure came from a new view of man himself. Renaissance artists and thinkers emphasized the great potential of man. The famous and influential Italian scholar Pico della Mirandola expressed this view in a famous essay from 1486 called Oration on the Dignity of Man, that reflected the more positive view of human nature that developed during the Renaissance. Mirandola stated, "To man it is granted to have whatever he chooses, to be whatever he wills." The Renaissance began in Florence, a city in the center of the Italian peninsula. Florence grew rich from the manufacturing of wool and banking. Surrounded by larger and more powerful neighbors, the people of Florence took great pride in their city and wanted to make it a center of wealth and culture that other cities would admire. Unlike most Italian cities that were ruled by a single individual, Florence was officially a republic in which the wealthiest families held all power. The Medici was one of the most powerful merchant families of the Renaissance. They used their money and influence to control Florence. They also used their wealth to support art, scholarship, and scientific research. The first member of the family to control the city was Cosimo. His grandson Lorenzo was known as the Magnificent because of his support for art and learning. Lorenzo sponsored many great works of public art in the city and created a library for scholars to study ancient texts. One of the most important features of the Renaissance was the rise of an intellectual movement called humanism, sometimes called the New Learning. Unlike scholars in the Middle Ages, who focused primarily on the study of religion, humanists focused more on the study of human behavior and institutions. Humanists stressed the importance of education. They revived interest in a method of education called the humanities that was popular in the classical world. The humanities emphasized the study of poetry, history, and philosophy. The basis of a humanist education would be learning from the great works of the classical Greek and Roman world. For example, humanists encouraged people to read and imitate the values of the great Roman politician and philosopher Cicero, who emphasized wisdom, virtue, and moderation. Humanists believed that a program of learning based on the humanities would make the individual happier and more virtuous and creative. Humanist ideals had a strong influence on the art, music, and literature of the Renaissance. Petrarch, a scholar from the city of Florence who lived in the 1300s, was an early Renaissance humanist. He is also known for his beautiful poetry that he wrote in Italian. Petrarch assembled a massive library of ancient Greek and Roman works that he had collected from monasteries and churches throughout Italy. Petrarch encouraged scholars to study these works and imitate their values. Because of his efforts, Renaissance scholars were able to study the works of such classical figures as Homer, Virgil, and Cicero. Other humanists made important contributions. Leonardo Bruni promoted an idea called civic humanism, which was the belief that humanists should become involved in politics and use their knowledge to improve government. The scholar Lorenzo Valla emphasized reading classical texts. He showed how many classical works had been poorly translated and encouraged scholars to find and study original manuscripts and create better, more up-to-date translations. Marsilio Ficino helped to revive interest in the ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. With the support of the Medici, Ficino even created an academy in Florence where scholars could discuss and debate Plato's works. During the Renaissance, people placed a high value on individual achievement. Men tried to show that they could master many fields of study or work. Someone who achieved this was greatly admired and referred to as a universal man or Renaissance man. Baldassare Castiglione wrote an influential book called The Courtier in 1528 that taught how to become such a universal man. A courtier is someone who serves in the court or government of a prince or noble. Castiglione was able to draw on his experience as a diplomat in writing this book. The Courtier is a manual on winning fame and gaining influence among the rich and powerful. To gain a position and a fortune, Castiglione recommends that the successful courtier study and read the classics and have extensive knowledge of history, poetry, music, and philosophy. He also must have good manners and be able to conduct himself properly in public. Finally, the courtier needs to know military strategy and weaponry. For women, the Renaissance had mixed results. On the one hand, girls from wealthy and upper-class families were able to receive a humanist education and study the classics. On the other hand, women still could not participate in politics and were discouraged from producing art and literature. The vast majority of women were still poor, and all women faced traditional restrictions on their lives. They were expected to focus on domestic affairs, raising children, managing servants, and running the household. A few women achieved importance during the Renaissance. Isabella d'Este was the most famous Renaissance woman. She married into the family that ruled the city of Mantua. She used her wealth and position to support many great Renaissance artists and thinkers. A few women did become prominent artists and writers. They usually wrote about personal subjects, not politics or classical literature. Vittoria Colonna was very active in the literary world of the Renaissance and gained fame for her beautiful and personal poetry. Renaissance art was very different from the art of the Middle Ages. Medieval art was not very realistic. It emphasized religious and spiritual themes. The art of the Renaissance reflected the influence of humanism. Although Renaissance artists also used religious subjects, their work was much more natural and realistic. It also put more emphasis on human emotion and personality. In this way, Renaissance artists tried to imitate the art of the classical world. Renaissance artists studied ancient Greek and Roman works and tried to revive and reproduce classical forms. Renaissance painters returned to the realism of classical times by developing new techniques for representing both humans and landscapes. In particular, the rediscovery of the rules of perspective allowed Renaissance artists to create realistic art. Ancient Roman artists knew about perspective, but that knowledge had been lost during the Middle Ages. Perspective was rediscovered in the 1400s. This technique allowed artists to make distant objects appear smaller than those close to the viewer, which gave the illusion of depth. Other techniques enabled Renaissance artists to give their work more energy and realism. Renaissance painters used a form of shading called sfumato to make objects look more round and real. They also used new oil paints that were easier to blend and apply in layers to create more realistic shades of color. Painters and sculptors also studied human anatomy and drew using live models. As a result, they were able to portray the human body much more accurately than medieval artists had done. The artistic Renaissance began in the wealthy Italian city-state of Florence in the early 1400s. The first great works of Renaissance art were completed by a young and talented painter named Masaccio, who created a series of frescoes that illustrated stories from the Bible, especially the lives of Jesus and his follower Peter. Masaccio's paintings, such as Tribute Money from 1425 shown here, are some of the first to use perspective and realistic renderings of people, and had an enormous influence on later Renaissance artists. The art of sculpture was revolutionized in the Renaissance due to the work of the brilliant Donatello. After studying classical statues, Donatello fashioned impressive sculptures of biblical figures, but made them incredibly realistic and very human in their expressions and their emotions. His statue of the biblical hero David, which he created for the Medici in 1432, was modeled on the way many ancient statues showed the beauty of the human body. Architecture was transformed in Renaissance Italy. Architects rejected the Gothic style of the Middle Ages as too disorderly and chaotic. Instead, they adopted the simple and elegant columns, arches, and domes that had been favored by Greek and Roman builders. For the cathedral in Florence, Filippo Brunelleschi created a majestic dome that he modeled on the Pantheon Temple in Rome. Brunelleschi designed many churches in which he incorporated classical designs. Like many Renaissance artists, Brunelleschi was multi-talented. He studied art and sculpture with Donatello, and was an accomplished engineer and scientist. The Renaissance in the arts had started in the city of Florence in the late 1300s, but the center of Renaissance art and culture shifted to Rome in the late 1400s. This happened because of political and religious turmoil in Florence in the 1490s. Also, the popes and many high-ranking members of the clergy used the wealth of the church to support the arts. They wanted to make Rome the most impressive and beautiful city in Italy. This period, often called the High Renaissance, was dominated by the three greatest artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Leonardo da Vinci was intensely interested in how things worked. He filled numerous notebooks with sketches and designs for everything from anatomy of the human body to fantastic machines that foreshadowed many modern inventions. He was truly a genius, and is a good example of the concept of a Renaissance man, because he achieved distinction in a number of different fields. He was a successful painter, scientist, and inventor. Leonardo's Mona Lisa is a beautiful portrait that reflects the Renaissance emphasis on the individual and the desire to capture the emotions and personality of people in art. The Last Supper shows Jesus and his disciples on the night before his crucifixion. The painting shows a deep understanding of human emotion, as each disciple has a unique expression. The painting also shows Leonardo's skill at using perspective. Like Leonardo, the artist Michelangelo had many talents. He was a sculptor, engineer, painter, architect, and poet. Michelangelo has been called a melancholy genius because his work reflected his many lifelong spiritual and artistic struggles. While only in his 20s, Michelangelo created two magnificent sculptures, the Pieta and the David. The Pieta captures the sorrow of Mary as she cradles her dead son Jesus in her arms. Michelangelo's statue of David shows him as a towering and heroic figure modeled on the statues of ancient Greece. In this way, it reflects the humanist faith in the beauty and potential of mankind. One of Michelangelo's greatest projects was painting a series of huge frescoes to decorate the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. The enormous task, which took 4 years to complete between 1508 and 1512, depicts scenes from the Old Testament of the Bible. His painting The Creation of Adam shows the influence of humanism and its glorification of the human body and the way it imitates classical art. Michelangelo was also a skilled architect. Like Brunelleschi, he moved away from the Gothic style of the Middle Ages and adopted the simple and elegant style of classical architecture. Michelangelo designed the dome for St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, which he began working on in 1546. It still wasn't finished when he died in 1564, and had to be completed by another architect. The artist Raphael was younger than Leonardo and Michelangelo, and studied their works. His unique style blended his faith in Christianity with classical themes. This is especially evident in his portrayals of Mary, the mother of Jesus, such as in his painting Madonna of the Meadow from 1506. Reflecting the influence of humanism, Raphael shows Mary as very tender and human. This was very different from most medieval depictions of Mary. Raphael's greatest work was the School of Athens, an imaginary gathering of great scientific and philosophical figures from the classical world. The painting uses new techniques such as perspective and celebrates the great achievements of the classical world that helped to inspire the Renaissance. Italian writers reflected the trademark Renaissance curiosity and interest in the humanities. They worked in a variety of styles and subjects, such as poetry, philosophy, politics, and history. While most medieval writing focused on religious subjects, Renaissance writers examined human behavior and emotions. Following the example of the medieval poet Dante, many Renaissance writers wrote in the vernacular or everyday language of their homeland, rather than Latin, which had been the language of scholarship and learning in the Middle Ages. Besides being a great humanist scholar, Petrarch also wrote beautiful poetry in Italian. He dedicated this poetry to a mysterious woman named Laura, who represented his ideal. The writer Boccaccio achieved fame for his Decameron, a series of stories about a group of young people seeking shelter from the plague in a country estate. Boccaccio uses humor and realistic insights into human psychology to bring his characters to life. One of the greatest writers of the Renaissance was Niccolò Machiavelli. He served as a diplomat for Florence, where he gained valuable experience in politics. Later, he was exiled from the city and devoted the rest of his life to writing plays, poetry, and history. Machiavelli's most famous work was The Prince, which he wrote in 1513. The Prince is a guidebook for rulers on how to gain and increase their power. Unlike ancient writers such as Plato, Machiavelli did not try to describe an ideal society. Instead, he focused on the way politics really worked. Based on his experience in Italy, where cities and families violently competed for wealth and power, Machiavelli argued that the successful prince must be intelligent and ruthless. He must be willing to do things that are traditionally thought of as immoral and unethical in order to preserve his power and protect his state. Machiavelli said that the ends justified the means. The good ruler used whatever methods were necessary to achieve his goals. Machiavelli famously declared that it was better for a ruler to be feared than loved. The term Machiavellian has now come to refer to the use of deceit and treachery in politics.